Lovely to be here with you again this morning. Just want to say thank you for coming. We love to be together. We're going to be looking this morning. I hope it's going to be helpful for Tom and Hannah and accessible to everybody. I'm a dad now of 4 sons, so I kind of feel like it takes me back to that moment when they're being dedicated or when they're really young, which I feel like I've, sometimes thank the Lord I'm no longer in that really tiny phase, but just I see every now and then I see little cartoons and things that take me back. Children, nature's horrible alarm clock. Are you relating to that one yet, Tom? The early morning wake-ups, and then if it hasn't already come, the playing of the games where you are told you're doing it entirely wrong. Do you feel me with that? You know where we're at with that? We want to just have a sense that we know God in the midst of life, real life that looks like this. Real life that is our life. We know Jesus wants to know us, and God comes to us in the midst of this. So what we're going to do today is just have a little look at what does it look like. Can you just turn me down a bit? What does it look like to actually engage with God in the midst of a real life? We're actually going to look at a book of the Bible which is called Leviticus. And when I first became a Christian and I kind of started trying to read the Bible, when I got to this book, I actually thought it was a joke. I actually thought, like, what's this book doing in here? It's unbelievably boring. And yet, as I've read it more times since, I've realized that sometimes just in the method, in the snowless of things, there's real beauty, there's real riches if you kind of choose to engage and let it set your pace. So we're just going to look at chapter 9 of it today, and I hope this is good for you. Let's just begin in verse 1 of chapter 9. On the 8th day, Moses summoned Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. He said to Aaron, "Take a bull calf for your sin offering and a ram for your burnt offering, both without defect, and present them before the Lord. Then say to the Israelites, take a male goat for a sin offering and a calf and a lamb, both a year old and without defect, for a burnt offering, and ox and a ram for a fellowship offering, to sacrifice before the Lord, together with a grain offering mixed with olive oil. For today the Lord will appear to you." They took the things Moses commanded to the front of the tent of meeting, and the entire assembly came near and stood before the Lord. Then Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded you to do, so that the glory of the Lord may appear to you." Moses said to Aaron, "Come to the altar and sacrifice your sin offering and your burnt offering, and make atonement for yourself and for the people. Sacrifice the offering that is for the people, and make atonement for them as the Lord has commanded." We'll come back to the rest of the chapter a little bit later, but I just want to pull out a first point. What does God say to us as we go through life, as we have a life that's just kind of ups and downs, positives, negatives? Well, I think the first thing he says to us is come to the altar. Come to the altar. God is a proactive seeker of people. I don't know what image of God you have. Do you know that he's proactively seeking you? He's calling you, come to the altar. Moses is the representative of God. He's been called by God, and God has said, "I'm going to put my words into your mouth." So when Moses speaks, we know he's speaking the desires and the words of God. And Moses says to a people, "Come." God says to you, "Come." And that might not be unexpected, except if you read the story and you know where we are in the story and you see who the people are. You see, the people are a people who've been called by God over and over and over again. And what we see is that God calls them and they say, "Nah, don't want to listen." And then God calls them again and they say, "Well, that's not going to work, what you're saying, God." And then God kind of does these wonders and sets them free from Egypt and helps them cross the Red Sea, parting the sea, and like, wow. And then God's like, here's what I want you to do. And they're like, oh, but you just don't look after us properly, God. And they're moaning about how God's looking after them. And then God's providing them with food, and he's saying, have the food, but don't do this with the food. And they just do exactly what he asks them not to do with the food. And then God says, look, of all things, I'm going to commit to you, I'm going to be with you, but the one thing I really want you to do to me is to worship me. Please don't worship other things. And as he's saying that, they're busy creating a calf to worship other things. I don't know how many times you would give somebody a warning and say, look, this is what I want you to do. And then you'd be like, okay, this isn't working out anymore. And the thing that you discover with God is that he never gets to that point. He just constantly says, come. Would you come? Would you come? I'm inviting you. Would you come? And so he speaks to the people who haven't listened, who haven't believed, who haven't followed, who've made a golden calf, and yet God still says, come. The story of the Bible is that God could do anything he wanted. He could do anything he wants. And yet what he wants to do is invite you to come to him. Jesus was many years after this particular passage. But he comes and says the same thing. He comes and over again, Jesus lives among a people. And if you look at the very first people who Jesus chooses, he chooses shepherds, who generally were regarded to be people who lived on the margins of society. They'd be like, the estate agents. They'd be the ones that we don't really want to necessarily think is doing a wonderful job. The politicians now. It's the opposite almost in our days. These are the ones who are on the outside. And yet God chooses them and says, hey, come, see my son. Jesus comes and he calls those who everybody else describes as the bad people. And he says, come. God is the one who says, I haven't come to the world to condemn it. I've not come to point my finger at you, but to call you, to save you. That's what I've come for. His first disciples were fishermen. They say probably that most boys who would grow up through Jewish faith would, around the age of 12, if they were really good, they'd have been recruited into following a rabbi. The key rabbis would go round and they'd say, come follow me, to one of the key people aged 12. And if you were sat there as a little boy aged 12 and you watched the rabbi come into the room and he says, come follow me, to some others, and you wait for another rabbi to come, he says, come follow me, and you're sat there and nobody comes, so you end up going to be a fisherman. So these are the people who are often overlooked, often not regarded highly, and yet Jesus says, come. God says, come. And I just want to encourage you, if you read the Bible, if you want to have a correct picture of who God says he is, you see in this book over and over again, the emphasis is on him saying to you, I want you. I want to love you. I want to be in relationship with you. Let's not think about the past. Now you come to me. I appeal to you. Come to the altar. And even if you don't read the Bible, maybe you're here and you don't read the Bible, you have no interest in reading the Bible, you have no sense that actually it's a book you want to read, and I totally understand that that's where many people are at. I want to suggest to you that even in life, God creates a desire, a sense of a calling to us. He calls to us, come, even just through how we are, how our world is. There's a guy called Blaise Pascal who was born in Rouen in 1623, a Frenchman. He was a mathematician. He invented the calculator. He also did a lot of groundwork for geometry and probability theory. You got any mathematicians? My dad's here, maths teacher. My mum's here, maths teacher. Mathematicians. Love mathematicians. He was a mathematician, and he said this, what else does this craving, this helplessness, these feelings I have within me proclaim, but that this is an infinite abyss inside of me that can only be filled with an infinite and immutable object. In other words, by God himself. What he's saying there is that almost like when you feel like, there's a gap inside of me, like something's not right in my life, I feel low, I feel down. even that feeling I have is God's call to you to say, hey, why don't you come to me? Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish thinker, philosopher, he called it angst. The word angst that we use so much now, anxiety and angst. Angst is actually a Danish word. He kind of created the idea of angst, that is an existential philosophy, the idea that this sense of angst is actually a longing for something beyond ourselves. And I want to suggest to you that the Bible shows that this angst is actually part of God's calling to you to say, come and find your rest in me. Come to me, come to me. This is the God that we have. And in the Bible times, around the kind of tent of meeting, as it were, they often used one of these. I think this is called a shofar, and they'd blow this. And it's almost like as this blows, it's like a call of God to say, I'm seeking you before you're seeking me. I'm wanting you before I'm wanting. Yeah, I want you before you want me. You know, he's the prime mover. He's the one who starts. Shall we try? I'm not necessarily very good, but we'll try. Zach's also a very accomplished trumpetist. Do you want to just come and give it a little blow? See if you can get a better noise out of it. We just need to make sure that Watford teaches you how to blow a shofar. I don't know how you come to worship, church. What you come to in worship, what your expectation is in worship. When I first started coming to church, I used to walk into a room and think, what are these people doing? Why are they singing like this? I remember I went to a conference, a big event, and everyone's singing, and I was thinking, what are they doing this for half an hour? And over time, I gradually began to realize they're responding to something. They're reacting towards something they've already seen. It's not that this is just a thing they're doing, they're responding. I want to suggest to you that when you come to worship, when we gather as worship church, we're responding to God. We're not calling on God for God to do something. We're responding to what He already has done, who He already is, His invitation He's already given. We're the reactor. We're like the passive ones responding to God. He's the subject and object. I can't remember which way around it is. And so worship, when we gather as worship, I don't want to tell you walk this way, talk this way. What are we doing? When we gather to worship, we come to say, recognize, God, you're already calling me, and I just respond to you. That's what true worship, true life of prayer is like. There's a form of prayer just within the week. I just wonder how you pray. Within a week, how are you when you make space to pray? I just wonder if your prayers are, God, I would like you to do this, and God, I would like you to do that, and God, this is my problem, God, that's my problem. He wants to hear those things. He wants to hear those things. But actually what you could do is just add on to the start of that to say, God, I recognize you are here with me. God, I recognize you have been watching over me. God, I recognize that you have already sent Jesus and you've died for me. And now I want to tell you the things that I need and I want. So God says, come to the altar. Back to Leviticus. So they took the things Moses had commanded to the front of the tent of meeting. And the entire assembly came near and stood before the Lord. Then Moses said, this is what the Lord has commanded you to do, so the glory of the Lord may appear to you. That's the motive. Moses said to Aaron, come to the altar and sacrifice your sin offering and your burnt offering and make atonement for yourself and for the people. Sacrifice the offering that is for the people and make atonement for them as the Lord has commanded. That's the bit we just did, as repeating that to get us back into the passage. Aaron came to the altar and slaughtered the calf as a sin offering for himself. His sons brought the blood to him, and he dipped his finger into the blood and put it on the horns of the altar. The rest of the blood he poured out at the base of the altar. On the altar he burned the fat, the kidneys, and the covering of the liver from the sin offering, as the Lord commanded Moses. The flesh and the hide he burned outside the camp. Aaron then brought the offering that was for the people. He took the goat for the people's sin offering and slaughtered it, and offered it for a sin offering as he did with the first one. He brought the burnt offering and offered it in the prescribed way. He also brought the grain offering, took a handful of it and burned it on the altar in addition to the morning's burnt offering. He slaughtered the ox and the ram as the fellowship offering for the people. His sons handed him the blood and he sprinkled it against the altar on all sides. But the fat portions of the ox and the ram, the fat tail, the layer of fat, the kidneys and the covering of the liver, these they laid on the breasts. And then Aaron burned the fat on the altar. Aaron waved the breasts and the right thigh before the Lord as a wave offering, as Moses commanded. And you read this and you think, what on earth are they talking about? What? Blood being flicked, animal parts being put in different places, wave offerings. Like a wave. Is that like an early version of like banners? Like waving a bit of meat. What on earth is going on here? And when I was at Cambridge University, I studied under one of the great professors of Hebrew and ancient Middle Eastern history, Dr. Andrew McIntosh. And he used to ask us this question: why are they doing this? And I used to have to go up to his study. He had a kind of an old room at the top of one of the courtyards in Cambridge, and you'd walk up the stairs, wooden stairs that would creak, and you'd open them and it'd creak open, and it'd be you kind of go in, and this old white-haired guy. Have you seen Harry Potter? Like some of the rooms, you go in there and it'd be like you feel like a dust everywhere, and he'd be sitting in his chair, and it's just you and him, one of the greatest minds in the world, and you. And you'll say, well, what's this all about then? And for an hour, you just sort of try and grapple with these things, and he'd help you. And this is what his take on it was. He's like, you see, the thing about people, the thing about people is that they say this. They say, Yahweh our God, he helped us in our battles, but can he make your turnips grow? But can he make your turnips grow? And you'd think, what are you talking about, Professor McIntosh? And he'd say this. The thing about people, the thing about all of us, he says, is that we're so prone to kind of just adopting a practice or copying what other people are doing or just kind of thinking something. But if we do that, if we never really bring our true selves, if we never really engage on a deep level with what's in front of us, we're so likely just to kind of veer off and jump onto something else. The Israelites, they kind of had been called by God. They'd seen God provide them grain, their ancestors' grain in a famine through Joseph. They'd seen God give them manna in the wilderness. They'd heard God say to them, I will watch over you. And yet when it came to a moment, they moved into a land and they thought, can this God really make our turnips grow? Can he feed us? Can he provide for us? Will he care for us? Or is he just a God who kind of operates in this field? And their assumed answer was no, so they began to worship and follow the practices of the Canaanites and worship Baal instead. See, what he was showing, what he was trying to get us to think through, Andrew McIntosh, was this: that God doesn't just want intellectual assent from you. He doesn't want you just to say, oh, I can see that you're a God. He doesn't want you just to kind of repeat phrases to him. He doesn't even want you just to kind of do religious practice. What he deliberately sets into the center of Israel is almost like a visceral practice. It's almost like an extended activity. And it draws on all your senses, and it kind of captures you and manifests before you the reality of this God. And as you have that kind of visceral experience of this God, it's an opportunity, it's a space for the true questions you have in your heart to be exposed and to be brought to him. It's a faith that's a deep faith. It's an extended, it's a faith where you come and you kind of interact in a presence with God. You've got to remember, we can read these things and be quite squeamish about animals, but these are farmers. These are farmers. These are guys who loved their animals. They dwelt with them often The animals would probably stay even maybe inside their tents, or certainly very close to them. They'd spend their days with these animals. Maybe they'd name them. And so when they offer these animals to the Lord, they're offering something so precious and close to themselves. It's not like a distant killing of something they don't care about. This is part of their life they're bringing. And so the invitation here, if we draw the parallel into the New Testament, is that when we come, if we respond to God's invitation to come, He really wants us to be present, to really be present when we come. It's like He creates a space for us to be present, the true selves, who we really are, to be present. Not just to go through some motions, kind of just ask a few questions and you just give a few answers and He wants this to be an experience, a time, a healing space. What we really want to see in this church, and what we pray and hope that we provide and you can begin to find in your own lives and train your children in how to find, is that space where their faith isn't just repeating what other people have told them to believe. But their faith is this thing that forges inside of their core, these deep questions, these major things they're going through, that's where it's wrestled with and dealt with. That's the only kind of faith that's worth having. Because otherwise, when something comes, you say, well, maybe they'll make my turnips grow. Maybe I'll just start doing that instead. And you become somebody who flip-flops and jumps forwards and backwards, and ultimately, hypocrisy is something that none of us like, and yet so many of us we find we're prone to. So a vision of your prayer life and your worship life is a place where your deepest questions, your biggest concerns, your greatest fears are brought before God. There's a guy called Dan Wilt. He's in the Vineyard movement in the USA, and his cousin was a humanitarian aid worker in the Horn of Africa, northern Kenya and Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia. And he was kidnapped with two others, and they were held hostage in Somalia for 3 months. They were tied to a stake, and every day they were wondering, is this the day I'm going to die? After 3 months they were set free, obviously traumatized and full on. But Dan Wilt asked his cousin, how did you cope with that time? How did you manage in that environment? And his cousin was very honest. He said, I'm not sure I did that well, but one thing I did do, there's somebody called Rita Springer who's written worship songs. And he said, as I was lying there in the hot sun, tied to this stake, wondering what was going to be happening to me, I could just, in those songs somehow, they created a sanctuary for me, a space for me to process what was going on. It was a place where I could encounter God and say, God, where are you in this? What are you doing in my life? Are you here? And he said those spaces in a day, somehow he could just create those spaces in a day that in the midst of this trouble and turmoil, this was a safe place. This was a place where he could really process and be. Have you got a space like that in your life? Have you got a space in your day where you can just go to? It's a safe place. It's a sanctuary. It's a place of provision for you to engage with things that are really important. Again, I just want to, if you're not a Christian, then I encourage you, find a place for that. If you are a Christian, if you're saying Jesus is a place, I want to encourage you, bring your real self into worship. Bring these questions you have. It's so easy to say, oh, I'm okay, everything's okay, but actually let the Lord dwell, let there be that sort of visceral experience of his presence and what he's calling you to. Oh, I need to deal with this. I find so often younger guys, younger Christians, they keep on saying, well, I want to know more, I want to know more. I was like this myself, and by knowing more, I think what they often mean is I want to just find out more facts that are in the book. And listen, facts are not bad. Facts are good things, but really to know more is to know God more. It's to know him knowing you more. All of this is like an invitation to a relationship. That's what it's about. If you want to know more, then create that space, engage with God in that space. And then finally, be restored. Aaron lifted his hands towards the people and blessed them. Having sacrificed the sin offering, the burnt offering, the fellowship offering, he stepped down. Moses and Aaron then went into the tent of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions on the altar. And when the people saw it, they shouted for joy, and they fell face down. They shouted for joy, and they fell face down. Be restored. God who calls you, come to the altar. God who provides a space for you there and says, bring your real self to this place. He then says, be restored. Be restored. Let me restore you. The dictionary definition of restoration is the action of returning something to its original owner, place, or condition. It's the action of returning something to its original owner, place, or condition. I just want to say that restoration requires action. Simple point, isn't it? Simple point, but restoration requires action. Prescribed and defined action is required. Restoration requires a decision to be made. Say, yes, I will be restored. I will restore this. It doesn't just happen. There's an action that takes place. The actions that God prescribed to the Israelites all those thousands of years ago was really centered around three things. All the stuff around the temple was around three particular things. One which was a sin offering, one which was burnt offerings, and one which was fellowship offerings. Three strands, God says, aspects to this restoration that people need. The sin offering was a goat, and it's saying, I want to be restored by being returned to my original condition, to my condition. I want you to restore me to my original condition. I recognize there's some things that I've done that have changed me, and I want to be restored back to how I feel like you made me to be. I want to be that. A burnt offering was a calf and a lamb. And a burnt offering was it's just this pure act of worship. It's just a giving of something really precious just to God. It's like saying, I want to return to my original place. To my original place. It's like, restore me to my original place. My original place is where I live under your leadership, God. I recognize that some things I've done done what I wanted and not what you said was the best thing. And I want to be restored to the original place. And then the fellowship offering, which is the greatest of the three offerings, and it's the climax of the offerings. It's an ox and a ram. And this says, I want to be returned to my original owner. I want to be returned to my owner. Restore me, bringing me back to my God. It's fellowship, and the word for fellowship also could be translated as peace or shalom. I want to return to my original owner. And this is the climax. This is the point of the offerings. This is the point of the whole thing. It's not to point out fault. It's not to make people have to spend money. The point of it all is the point is they bring them to the place where they say, I now am back with my God. I'm back with my God, and there's peace is reigning in our community. And the great narrative of the Bible is that God created people to be with him and to know him, and then it's almost like a dislocation happens, something where God was taken out of the center of his creation. And the taking of God out of the center of creation, the removing him from the place that he created himself, the world for him to be, like the removing of him out of that, then creates there's this sense of it's lost balance, it's lost order. Creation is imbalanced. There's this thing going on, and so what God's trying to do for his people through his offerings is say, let me put you back into peace, into shalom. It's like, have you ever been somewhere and there's like a screaming baby, and you're like, oh, please, can just somebody please just quieten that baby down? Like, oh my goodness, it's just so loud, and I just want that noise to end. And in our kind of Western view of peace, the peace is when the noise stops. But in the Hebrew, in God's words here, it's not just when the noise stops, it's then when a beautiful tune begins to come in its place, a tune of harmony and delight and joy. It's a positive term. Shalom. I don't know if you've ever... Oh, just click back a second. I don't know if have you ever been in a canoe, like a Canadian canoe? You ever been in a Canadian? Yeah. My brother was studying at York University in Canada for a while, in Toronto. And so I went to see him, and we went to a place called Algonquin Park, which is a big wilderness space. And we went canoeing. And what we'd do is we'd have big backpacks. We'd carry all our tents and everything in the backpacks, and then you kind of, the two of you would share a canoe, and you'd travel up and down the lakes and the rivers. And it was wonderful and beautiful, apart from the fact that there was, at the beginning, when we first arrived, I don't know what we were doing wrong, but somehow the balance of the canoe was off. And as we were canoeing a lake, suddenly the guy who was our guide is like, "What are you guys doing?" We're like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Look at your canoe, it's all over the place. Like, you're on the brink of falling in." He's like, "You understand, if you fall in here, you'll sink. Like, you've got heavy stuff on you. You're going to sink, and this thing is like 100 meters deep." And we both went from like, "Isn't it a nice view?" to be like, "Oh, like, what are we going to do?" And he's like, "Where's the weight in your canoe? Where's the weight?" And we realized it was all off balance. All the weight was at one end. He's like, "Just put the weight in the center. Put the weight in the center of the canoe, and then it'll be balanced." And the fellowship offering is almost like the Lord saying to you, just put the weight of creation back where it should be, at the center of your life. Let me, my presence be at the center. That's what his appeal to you is. That's what restoration is. To come back to the Creator. In the Old Testament, it was through giving of sacrifices, but now restoration in the New Testament is invited by God to be done through worship, particularly through the use of song. And the New Testament church so often use song, and that's why we sing so much here. In Ephesians 5, it says, "Do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Don't get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. Speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Sing and make music in your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ." And so singing, as we do, when we sing and acknowledge God, it's almost like we're saying, would you put the weight back at the center of our canoe? Would you be back in the place that you should be, our God? Because then life feels like it has a shalom in it. Then life feels like this kind of screaming, annoying noise that I just wish I could stop. It begins to fade. And instead, the beautiful sense of harmony and the tune of joy comes into my ears. So when we come in true restorative worship, when we come and sing, we come to create a space, not just to find words that we like but it's a space. A friend of ours, our old church, Monique, she was a mother of 4 children, and when I think she was pregnant, and when she got to the end of her term, this is when she still had 3 children, the end of her term, she found out very last minute that actually her 4th child was probably not going to survive the birth. And they said to her, "Would you know, what are you going to do? I think you," and she had to end up going through the birthing process once the child had already died. And so she gave birth to this beautiful little child who was dead the first time she actually laid eyes on him. And as she saw her child, the doctors so sweetly, they took like a plaster cast and they put it on the foot. So at least after the child was buried, she'd have like a memory of this baby, this image of the plaster cast that at least would be like, you know, kind of, this is the memento. And as she was traveling home from the hospital, one of her kids had just been saying, let me carry it, let me carry the plaster cast. She's tired and full of grief, and she said, "Okay, fine." And as the child was carrying it, the child tripped and smashed this cast on the ground. And we saw Monique. She was in our house group. We saw her. We knew her. And we're like, how do you cope with that? What do you do with that kind of situation? Like, where do you go when that kind of thing happens? And she said, "I just chose to come and be present in worship. I just chose to come to church And as the worship was coming, that space for me was a healing space. I couldn't sing, I couldn't do anything, but I just stood and tears would run down my mouth, and sometimes I'd have to almost scream. The pain was so much, but just week in, week out, God met me there. He began to restore me there. He began to change me there. And by the time we knew her, she was one of the most joyful, wonderful, wonderful women. Not false. There was still a deep sadness in her eyes. There were still moments where she would be full of grief, and yet there was a joy. And in the passage, we see that a people have come to God, and his response, his restoration, his choosing of them brings joy. With Jesus, we see again and again people whose lives are real lives, troubled lives, difficult lives, some of them being martyred, some of them being ignored, many of them being maligned. Again and again, the overwhelming emotion of the New Testament church as we read through it in the New Testament is one of joy and awe. Bless you. It's joy and awe. If you want a life that's more joyful and has more awe, if you want to raise Alfie or your children, you can't fabricate those things. You can't fake those things. Those things can only come when the deepest part of somebody has constantly been restored and being found in the place of restoration. And I want to tell you, there's no better place than a place of worship of Jesus Christ, singing with his people in a time of prayer through the week as you sit and you say, "Here I am, God, and here you are too." I want to encourage us, church, that as we come and hear the Lord, let's respond to him. Let's be real. Let's be real when we come. But let's engage with this restoration that he wants to give us. Let's let him bring a healing and a reality to our lives that we desperately need for our joy and for our awe. Shall we pray?